Tom has worked in journalism, policy development, and was interested to read as a bookseller. He graduated with honours in history and has also studied music, and he lives in Melbourne at the moment. So welcome, Tom. Great to have you here tonight.
Great. Thank you, Di. I'm not sure if I need this. Is this loud enough for everybody in the back? Yep. Yeah. Sorry as well for my shameless self-promotion as well, but I've learned in this industry you have to self-promote to sell any sort of books. But I'm so thrilled to be here, and thank you so much, Di, and to Duncan and Joan for shouldering the organisational burden of this event. It was important for me to have an event in this store, particularly for three different reasons. The first of which is, as Di said, I have a very personal connection to this part of the world. My father's side of the family has owned property in Meetung forever, and yes, we have been holidaying down here for my whole childhood, through my childhood and into my adult years. And the second reason, quite separate from that first reason is quite separate from the book, but the second reason actually is inextricably linked to the subject of this story. The protagonist of this book is a man by the name of Brian Rofe, who was my grandfather. And immediately after the events that transpired and are recounted in the story, immediately after his experiences in Timor, he was posted to RAF Station East Sale as the meteorological officer in control of all weather information for the three aerodromes that were based here in East Gippsland. West Sale, East Sale, and of course Bairnsdale, the old aerodrome, which I gather is about 10 kilometres south of where we're standing, or where I'm standing today. For him it was a mixed experience. It was a joyous experience to be away from Timor and away from the front lines, quite obviously, and this was very much a place where he recuperated. It was the first extended period of time that he would spend with his young bride, my grandmother, Patricia Rofe. They'd only got married in June 1942 and he was here in early 1943. But the experience for him was also quite tragic, and I was reminded of that when I was driving in today. I pulled in with my girlfriend, we pulled into the Beaufort Gardens to see the memorial there, and I was absolutely shocked to see, and I counted them, at least 250 names of aircrew that died in accidents during the period of the war where this was an operational training unit. And I recalled my grandmother telling me a story about how she used to go out with Brian and have, slap up dinner parties with friends, and they'd do the same thing a week later, but there would be less 2 or 3 people, and that was an experience that would be repeated during the 12 months that he was posted to East Sale. Eventually he would be posted back into the tropical regions, and then eventually up into the islands of Australia to the north towards the end of the war. But he never forgot Sale, and I was reminded as well of my family's experiences on my maternal side about Sale, because my aunt, Sister Deborah Rofe, was born in Sale. And so I have a very strong connection on both sides of my family to this region. So for that reason, it was obvious to me that I was going to have a book event in this part of the world, and I'm so thrilled that you were able to facilitate that. I said to her at the beginning of tonight that I just love her bookstore, and it is perfect for an event such as this, and thank you everybody for turning out in such strong numbers tonight. I wanted to do 3 things for this book presentation, the first of which is give you a sense of the strategic significance of Timor, the particular theatre of war where this story is based. The second is to expand on my personal connection to the story, and the third is to expand on what I think is the value of this story beyond it being hopefully a gripping yarn that keeps you all awake for the next few nights as you read the story. So first of all, to Timor. This is not a perfect map of the region, but it will do for the purposes of tonight. It's not a perfect map because it is a modern map of the Indonesian archipelago, and the nations that lay claim to these islands and to these territories have changed considerably since the Second World War. But the way in which it's been colour-coded means that it does actually suit the purposes of this presentation. These islands here in brown are modern Indonesia, but at the beginning of the war were part of a sprawling Dutch colony known as the Netherlands East Indies. Incidentally, this area down here in yellow is the island of Timor. The regions up the top here in green are British possessions of British Malaya, British North Borneo, and obviously Singapore. This here is the southern peninsula of the Philippines, which at the beginning of the war was an American protectorate, and obviously down here in the southeast, in the right-hand corner of the map, as you look at it, is the northern coast of Australia, obviously Darwin. To win this war, the war in the Pacific, you needed to win the war in the air. The reasons for that is because the advancements that had been made in military aircraft meant that air superiority was everything. And that meant modern air force, but it also meant military aerodromes. Aerodromes that were big enough and equipped to handle heavy bombers such as this, the consolidated B-24 Consolidated Liberator. Surely one of the most destructive weapons that mankind has ever built, until of course it was superseded by the B-29 Superfortress, that deliverer of the atomic bomb. The aerodromes also needed to accommodate aircraft such as this. The American-made Lockheed Hudson, originally built as a general reconnaissance aircraft, but modified, such as this one, into a medium bomber with the turret gun up the top here, clear perspex glass where there was machine guns and a ventral gun coming out of the bottom of the belly, which you can't see. And finally, aerodromes needed to accommodate, perhaps most importantly, fighter aircraft, such as this formation of the P-40 American Kitty Hawk. Fighter aircraft were absolutely pivotal in forming the defensive armament of any aerodrome, along with anti-aircraft batteries. They were vital to holding these aerodromes. And when these aerodromes had been built and when existing airfields had been completed, they would form this vast interconnected network of aerodromes. This is just a snapshot of those aerodromes. They do actually go further east, right, over across to the Solomon Islands, and further northwest up to Indochina and Thailand. And they would form what was known as the Malay Barrier, that defensive perimeter that it was hoped would hold back a northern invasion by the rapacious armies of the Japanese. Now when you look at this map, you might think that Timor is just one piece in this interconnected puzzle, no more or less important than any other of these aerodromes. Here's Timor down the bottom here. But you would be wrong. In fact, Timor did have strategic significance, which this map sort of highlights. I have here highlighted with the red arrow the three perhaps most important aerodromes in the Malay Archipelago, as it was known, in the southwest Pacific. We have down the bottom RAF Station Darwin. Over here we have the aerodrome in Batavia, which was Batavia was the central administration of the Netherlands East Indies. Batavia is these days known as Jakarta. And up the top, of course, we have RAF Station Tengah in Singapore. And each of these countries, Great Britain, the Dutch and Australia, place different strategic importance on Timor. With respect to Australia, that strategic significance is perhaps most obvious of all. Should the Japanese capture Timor, then in all likelihood, all Japanese raids and strafing attacks on our important military installations here in Darwin and further south down here to Broome would be staged out of Timor. Sir Robert Menzies said at the beginning of the war that for Australia to lose Timor to the Japanese would be the equivalent of the British losing the Midlands to Germany, a dagger pointed at the heart of England. So important was Timor that Australia committed Sparrow Force to garrisoning the airfield here called Penfui, which was about 6 miles east of the capital of Dutch West Timor, a town called Kupang. Sparrow Force was a detachment of 8th Division units built up around the 2nd 40th Battalion, about 1,400 troops that would bolster the existing Dutch naval force of 500 soldiers. Timor's significance to the Dutch was quite separate altogether. Timor was perceived as a vital staging point that would enable heavy bombers, medium bombers and fighter aircraft to stage through from Darwin. In essence, it was a connection, a lifeline to the Australian mainland. Aircraft would have to stage through from Darwin to Timor, to Bali, Denpasar and then to Batavia. And similarly, the British saw Timor as part of this network of strategic staging points. Timor, Denpasar, Batavia, Palembang in Sumatra. I now want to advance our story. It should be noted, I should say, that were any of these aerodromes lost, Timor or Denpasar or Palembang, then each of those two very important aerodromes would be isolated. So now we advance the story to February 18, 1942. As you can see, the Malay Barrier has effectively been swept aside. Palembang in Sumatra is gone. Singapore was lost on 3 days earlier. British Malaya is gone. North Borneo is basically gone. Celebes, Baru and Ambon in the Philippines is under attack. On the morning of February 18, 1942, a man by the name of Wing Commander Frank Headlam, who was the officer commanding the Penfui airstrip, received a reconnaissance report. And that reconnaissance report reported that a huge Japanese task force was steaming south from here from the Celebes on a direct course to Timor. This came as no huge surprise to Headlam. For the last 4 weeks, Timor had been subject to repeated raids and strafing attacks. And in fact, the perception or the feeling in Timor was very much that invasion was imminent. After Headlam was handed that reconnaissance report, he almost immediately received a signal from Batavia, from a man by the name of General Sir Archibald Wavell, who was the commanding officer of all Allied forces in the Far East. And Wavell told Headlam that in light of this reconnaissance report, the RAF was to pull out of Timor. But he added a caveat, and the caveat was this, that a skeleton crew of 29 airmen was to remain behind to keep that airbase operational until the last moment. And the reason for that, as I said earlier, if you lose Timor, if the RAF were to pull out of Timor, then that lifeline, that connection to Batavia would be lost. And Java, or Batavia, had become extremely important in the context of what had happened over the course of the first 2 months of the war. Now that Singapore was lost, that so-called impregnable fortress, the most meaningful Allied stronghold in the Far East was now Java. Java could not be isolated, or it shouldn't be isolated until the very last moment. And for that reason, Wavell ordered that Timor was to be kept operational until the last moment. It is perhaps also worth noting that Wavell's order might have been issued from a position of self-interest, because he was holed up in Batavia at this time as well. Nevertheless, Headlam pulled out half of his airmen and left behind and chose 29 airmen to remain behind. He appointed this man, Flight Lieutenant Brian Rofe, my grandfather. I don't bear much of a resemblance to the man, I don't think, but looking very sharp there as a flight lieutenant. And he said to Rofe, Headlam said to Rofe before he left, that two Hudson bombers would be dispatched from Darwin to come and collect you on the evening of February 19, 1942. Reconnaissance had positioned the task force as landing in Timor on the morning of February 20. February 19 would give them ample time to get out. Headlam, Rofe, and none of the airmen that were left behind could possibly imagine the devastation and the catastrophe that would happen next, which of course was the bombing raid on Darwin on the morning of February 19, 1942, which among many things including claiming probably around 300 lives and wounding grievously many others, destroyed the aircraft that had been designated to collect Rofe and his men. And really, so begins an odyssey of 58 days. But before that, on the morning of February 20, 1942, my grandfather, Brian Rofe, woke up having heard no word from Darwin, because the other thing that happened to Darwin on the morning of February 19 is that all communications between Darwin and Timor had been lost. He didn't know what was going on. He woke up on the morning of February 20, 1942, and from his wireless station up on a dry creek bed that looked across the aerodrome and further afield to Kupang Bay, where he was based, he saw this, the Jinsu, a four-stacker light cruiser. Surrounding the Jinsu were 3 Japanese destroyers. All at once they brought their guns to bear and the aerodrome erupted in flames. This shelling attack lasted for approximately 12 minutes and then inexplicably stopped. It was overtaken by the sound was overtaken by 34 Betty bombers that dropped huge payloads on important defensive positions around Kupang Bay. My grandfather looked across the aerodrome in flames and realised he had only one option available, and that was to quit the aerodrome and take his men into the mountainous interior of Timor, which is precisely what he did. Here is Penfui here marked with the aeroplane. He piled his men into 2 GMC trucks and headed down to Yusaka Basar and then burnt rubber right up to here to Champlong. As they were passing through this town at Babao, somebody in the back of the truck that my grandfather was driving shouted out, "Fighters." My grandfather swerved the truck over the side, they all piled out, and the world erupted in bullets as they were being strafed by a Japanese Zero. My grandfather at that point recalls looking at a man who was sitting alongside him taking cover in this hole where he found cover protection, and saw this man's mouth moving, but he couldn't hear anything that he was saying. He became aware of an incredibly loud droning noise and then looked up and saw another formation of 2 sets of 17 Japanese Becky bombers flying at the extraordinarily low altitude of 400 feet. At that point, my grandfather registered 2 thoughts, the first of which is that all was lost in Kupang, but also that he was probably going to die. But instead of seeing bombs being dropped out of the bomb bay doors, he saw white silk. My grandfather had stopped his men in the middle of a drop zone as Japanese paratroopers were pouring out of aeroplanes. There were 400 Japanese paratroopers that jumped out on that day. As they were coming down, my grandfather had 15 seconds. That's how long it takes for a paratrooper to jump from 400 feet to land on the ground. 15 seconds to pile his men into the truck and hope like hell they don't get cut off. Obviously they didn't. They made it up to here to Champlong, which was Army headquarters, ditched the 2 trucks and then set a course north up to Kapsali. The hope was that with a 400-pound radio transceiver which they'd salvaged from the aerodrome and would eventually re-establish contact with Darwin with, that they could rearrange an evacuation, this time a rescue by flying boat up on the northwest coast. The problem was supplies. They only had effectively a sack full of tin food and a handful of medical supplies, but my grandfather figured or estimated that it would take roughly a week to walk from Champlong over Fatu Laula, Forbidden Rock, as it was called, to give a sense of how remote and rugged this terrain was, up to the Protestant mission of Musu, and then west to Kapsali. It would take roughly a week, and it did. And they managed to re-establish contact with Darwin and arrange a flying boat rescue on the morning of March the 3rd, 1942. Once again, the evacuation was thwarted, this time by the devastating raid that was carried out on Broome. The first aircraft that was destroyed in that raid was the Centaurus, the Empire flying boat that had been designated to collect my grandfather and his men. On that morning, my grandfather received a message from Darwin that said, "All flying boats destroyed, no hope possible from our end." And so begins really an odyssey that would last 58 days. 58 days where every one of those 29 men would contract malaria, dysentery, dengue fever, jungle rot, beriberi. 4 of those men would die of illness, 1 would die of a snake bite. No less than 3 Japanese patrols, one as big as 300 troops, was dispatched from Kupang down here up to their position after their location was betrayed to the Japanese by Timorese who were friendly to the occupying force. As I said, I have a very personal connection. I'd like to leave the story at this point because I don't want to give too much away about what happened and tell you a bit about my grandfather, Brian Roth. This story really starts with my personal connection with Roth. He was a man that I never met. He died exactly 9 years to the day before I was born. And what I knew of the man could more or less be distilled down to a selection of photographs that my grandmother used to display in her family home in Adelaide. And these photos are unusual for 2 reasons. The first of which is that they all captured my grandfather in a moment of staggering high achievement. Here we have Brian posing for his official portrait, having been made Director of Australia's Antarctic Division. Here we have my grandfather in Leningrad at the height of the Cold War, having been sent over as the Australian delegate to the International COSPAR Space Conference, where he'd meet, among many dignitaries, Neil Armstrong, less than 12 months after he returned from the moon. This is not my grandfather, but I always think that it's inextricably linked to his story. This is the launch of RESAT-1, the first Australian satellite to be put into outer space. Australia was the 4th nation to achieve that feat behind the USA, the USSR and France. And my grandfather was the director of Project RESAT. When I asked my grandmother why she included it, at a very young age I might add, when I asked her why she included this in her family gallery of photos, she said that this was Brian's rocket. So I always grew up thinking that my grandfather was actually on that rocket, but he wasn't. And finally, here we have Brian Roth, the decorated squadron leader with moustache neatly clipped and hat rakishly angled, looking a bit like Errol Flynn, we always say. If you look closely here, you can see the decoration, the ribbon, the MBE that he was awarded as a consequence of his actions in taking command of that group of stranded airmen. I said before that these photos are unusual for 2 reasons. The second reason is because they're all photos of my grandfather on his own. There were never any photos of Brian with his bride, or holding one of his children, or in an informal snap with his mates. And as a consequence, I think, of that, I always grew up with a very specific image of my grandfather. And that image was of a man of staggering high achievement, a great leader of men, the foremost expert in tropical meteorology and aerospace science and upper atmosphere research. But I couldn't empathise with that kind of man. He was held up as a paragon of achievement, a paragon of valour, and a kind of cult of personality was built up around my grandfather. But I never really knew who the man was, what really made him tick. And what augmented that sense of remoteness that I felt towards my grandfather was this photo, which my grandmother also included. Now, I said before that he was always on his own, but this is the exception to that rule. Although I bear a more striking resemblance these days to the man over here on the left, that's my grandfather. This photo was taken, as you can see, in Washington DC in 1963. It was the second time Brian Rove met Hiram Cassidy, at this stage a Rear Admiral in the United States Navy, retired. The first time that they met was on the deck of an American submarine in the dead of night off the northwest coast of Timor, after the two men had carried out the most implausible rescue imaginable. That's interesting, but what's important from the perspective of the research of this book for me was that this photo, what lies at the heart of the photo, is the event that it commemorates. And I always knew as I looked at this photo in its original position, on the last day that I saw it in its original position, which is interestingly on my grandmother's funeral, because I was taking a turn through her house to have a look at everything in its original spot. I looked at this photo and I realised if I was to ever understand what made my grandfather tick, I would have to go to Timor. And so in that sense, this photo lies at the heart of this story. So I went to Timor in 2011. I went to the El Tari airport, which is built upon the old coral strips, which are here in the foreground of this photo, and here in 1942. This is the military aerodrome where my grandfather served. I went down to the Kupang Harbour, just as my grandfather did, and watched the sun set over Kupang Bay, as my grandfather did before the war. I went to the Kupang Harbourside Market and bartered for food, just as my grandfather had bartered for silverware and textiles in the market prior to the war. Then I went on a journey into the interior. Here is Phaku Lao. Incredibly, my grandfather and his men scaled over the top of that mountain. This is as far as I got, then I jumped in the car and went around it. But as you can see, this is a wonderful photo that gives you a sense of how rugged the terrain was that my grandfather entered. I walked across the Kapsali River and met some incredibly small people, but wonderful people. Fortunately, I crossed the Kapsali in the dry season. My grandfather and his men were not so lucky. I stood upon the beaches where my grandfather and his men waited time and time again for a flying boat to come rescue them that never arrived. I went up to a mountainside, a bluff, and looked down onto the secret Timorese safe haven, Sumbayan Lair, unbeknownst to my grandfather, an area so impenetrable that you can't to this day get in there without Timorese escort. I looked up and down the coastline where my grandfather and his men hunted for food, and I stayed in the villages such as this one in Tuakau, perhaps in the same huts that my grandfather and his men were sheltered and fed and concealed by Timorese that were loyal to the Allied forces and displaced servicemen trapped behind lines. I also met this wonderful man, Simon Bibello, Tunukang of Manuelo. Tunukang means the chief. This man met my grandfather, but he knew him as a different name. He called him the Tuan Besai, which means the big boss, which gives you an indication again of the respect and the reverence with which the local people had for my grandfather, I think. I asked this man through my translator if he knew what happened to my grandfather and his men, and he said they were swallowed up by a big fish. And if you know the ending of the story, there's an element of truth to that. And finally, I stood upon a beach where one night in April 1942, my grandfather saw a light flickering out to sea. He knew at last, after 2 months of being trapped on Timor, rescue was at hand. I came back to Melbourne, where I'm from, and I was obsessed. I did a beeline for this building called Frostley, where my grandfather trained to be a meteorological officer. Here you have my grandfather down the bottom enlisting in the RAF. This man here holding the slide ruler his name was Archibald Shields. Arch was once upon a time a household name in Melbourne, where he was a star centre-half forward for the Carlton Football Club. Like so many men, his prime athletic years were taken from him because of his service to the war. He would later on be awarded an MBE for his services to tropical meteorology. I studied my grandfather's training, where he became an expert on synoptic analysis and isobaric analysis, where he had to commit to memory no less than 2,500 separate ciphers because weather information was perceived to be vital intelligence, they had to send it in code. Basically, he had to learn in the space of 6 months a course, an amount of information that could fit into a 3-year university degree. Thanks to a rigorously enforced heritage overlay as well, this building has hardly changed at all. It stands on the corner of Drummond and Victoria Street. Wonderful. After I'd done my research in Melbourne, I went to the States and I met this man. I didn't meet that man, I met the daughter of this man. He was the long-dead daughter, the daughter of a long-dead submariner, Hiram Cassidy. Came back from that experience, I went around Australia and I tried to find survivors of the story. And I was so fortunate to meet 4 wonderful men, Len Burke from Sydney, Clyde Pappen from Adelaide, Frank Rusconi and Eddie Park from Melbourne. I always mention their names because I hold them in such high regard. And it was meeting these men and talking about their experiences on Timor that the premise of this book changed. It was no longer a story about my grandfather. This was a story exclusively about my grandfather. This was a story about what happens to ordinary men trapped in the extraordinary circumstances of war. And through those survivors, I was able to ask very specific questions about the wartime experience for them. But what's it like to be strafed by a Japanese Zero? What's it like to be bombed from the sky and shelled from the sea at the same time? What's it like to have malaria, every tropical malady imaginable, and then watch your best mate die of malaria and then be told by a senior officer, my grandfather, that before you bury him, take off your shoes because yours are falling apart, you've got a long way to go. But what's it like to give up all hope of being saved when you hear word that a patrol of 300 Japanese paratroopers has been dispatched to your position with the intent of hunting you down, interrogating you for information, and then summarily executing you? And what's it like when all hope is lost to receive word of a rescue, but in order to be rescued you have to swim in the dead of night through a 16-foot surf that you know for a fact is shark and crocodile infested? How do you physically steel yourself for an experience like that? How do you psychologically steel yourself for an experience like that? Thanks to those 4 very special men, I was able to get answers to those questions. And I think in addressing the book in that way, in addressing or approaching the research in that way as a story about what happens to ordinary people trapped in war, dropped into the extraordinary circumstances of war, I stumbled upon a personal revelation about military history, or more specifically, why I think we are constantly turning back to our military past as an area of inquiry and examination. And that's because of what it tells us about us. This story, I think its value is about what it tells us about us. War, I think, augments the very best and the worst of human capability. The heroic and the horrific, the virtuous and the vile. So now when I'm thinking of extreme examples of human behaviour, I need only think about the characters in this story, such as this group of extremely brave men. This is the RAF rear party that was left behind, the skeleton crew. Here is my grandfather in the front and centre, 24 years of age. It's important to note as well, I should say, that he took command of a group of men, 20 of whom were older than him, as old in some cases as this man, Jock Birchall, who was 41 years of age and actually served in the First World War, could have rightly expected to be handed command of this group. His leadership was extraordinary. The courage of the group on whole was phenomenal. All of these men were drawn from different parts of the country, different skills, different musterings. The one thing that they had in common is that all of these men had no dependents, no wife, no children. And every one of these men knew that when men without dependents were chosen exclusively for a mission, some were expected to die. They volunteered all the same. Now when I'm thinking of human capacity for skill and daring do, I think of Harold Cook, Cookie, my grandfather's great mate, who flew his lumbering Lockheed Hudson on a bombing run over Kupang Bay after it was lost to the Japanese. En route, Cookie was intercepted by 5 Japanese Zeros, an aircraft that flies 60 miles per hour faster than a Hudson and is considerably more agile. Not only did he continue that bombing run and drop his bombs and unleash hell and fury below, he fought off those Zeros for an hour, was brought down over Kupang Bay, but somehow lived to tell the tale. Now when I'm thinking of loyalty and courage and the unbelievable, unbreakable human spirit, I think of Jamias Cohen-Flora, Tumukang of Pariti, chief of Pariti. For reasons that nobody's ever properly ascertained, Cohen Fora fed, sheltered and concealed countless Allied servicemen displaced after the Japanese invasion. He did it at unbelievable personal risk. When he was eventually betrayed to the Japanese by his cousin, of all people, Cohen Fora was taken down to the sea where his village was, down to the bay where his village was based, and forced to drink seawater. And so began a period of 6 months of unending torture. He was taken up into the mountain's interior. His clothes were stripped from his body. He was tied to a tree and beaten with sticks and logs until one of his arms was broken. After that, after he refused to say anything, he was thrown into a hole. When he stood up, that hole came to the lip of the hole came to his chin. His arms, incidentally, were still tied behind his back. For a period of 10 days, he was fed a single ball of rice, which was rolled to the lip of that hole. He remained hydrated by slurping the dew that collected around the lip of that hole. After 10 days, he still had said nothing, was taken out and beaten every day in a punishment cell that had been built by the dreaded Kempai Tai, the Japanese secret police. What's extraordinary to me about Cohen Fora is that for the remainder of his 6 months of incarceration, he never said a word. He didn't beg for forgiveness, plead for mercy, nor, importantly, did he betray the location of a group of airmen who he had helped and who he had saved. Had he done that, I wouldn't be standing here before you to deliver this speech. I regard him as an unsung hero of this story. Down the bottom here you can see the Dutch, which has just been cut off. This is a photo of a photo, so it's not a great quality. It's the Dutch silver and bronze star that the Dutch awarded him. He was also received a financial award from the Royal Australian Air Force, and rightly so. When I think about genius, I think of Corporal Ron Bell, sitting here with cigarette in mouth, working away on the 400-pound radio transceiver. Ron was a radio ham enthusiast before the war and an absolute wizard on the wireless. When I asked Len Burke, one of the survivors of this story, what he thought of Ron, it should be said that Ron was about 5 years older and was a senior wireless operator over Len and was greatly revered by all wireless operators. I said to Len, what did you think of Ron? And he thought about it and he said, Ron used to ply his trade with the finesse of a concert pianist performing Beethoven. I think it's a wonderful description. Len Burke, I think, sees the world through novelist's eyes. Were it not for this man's skill and ingenuity in holding together that radio transceiver with materials essentially sourced from the jungle, again, I wouldn't be standing here before you today. When I think of the human capacity for extreme violence, I think of Akira Sato, not pictured in this photo, but this is the unit to which he belonged, the Japanese naval paratroopers. Sato was administrative personnel in the Yokosuka 3rd Special Naval Force, which meant that he was entitled to wear combat gear but not permitted to ever jump from a plane. And as a consequence of that, would never be accepted by his unit. He knew that to fit in, to be accepted, he had to do something remarkable. So he volunteered for an execution and carried out the so-called perfect execution, clean decapitation of a man's head. As a consequence of that, he was accepted into his group, into the unit, and held up in great esteem. He would also, at the end of the war, be tried as a war criminal and sentenced to death. When I think of the human capacity for extraordinary gallantry, I think of Ensign George Cook. Pictured here is the captain of the taking command of the USS Rankin in 1964, I believe it was, which was a destroyer tender. So yes, there is a Captain Cook in this story, ladies and gentlemen. Something for everybody. Cook was a Naval Reserve officer in the United States Navy. He served upon the USS Otis, which was a submarine tender. When the Otis was bombed in Java, he was recruited aboard the USS Sea Raven, a submarine that was under the command of Hiram Cassidy. Cook would be one of his 6 officers. That meant that Cook was permitted to wear the Twin Dolphin insignia of the US Naval Submariner, but he would never be accepted by his crew until he proved himself worthy of wearing that Twin Dolphin insignia. He too knew that he had to do something extraordinary. So he volunteered for the most dangerous mission imaginable. On the April 9th, 1942, after the Sea Raven Cassidy had made contact with the Australian airmen on a beach in northwest Timor and arranged a rendezvous point, the Sea Raven surfaced and a wherry, a 16-foot boat that was contained in the superstructure of the submarine, was launched over the side. Incidentally, this was all happening in in the dead of night. Cook volunteered to take command of that wherry. With 2 other crew members, they rowed the wherry to the edge of the surf line. The original intention was to row that boat to the beach, but the surf was running so high at 16 feet, he knew that if he was to row the boat through the waves, the boat would likely capsize and the mission would be a disaster. So Cook took off his shirt and attached a long line that he intended to swim to the shore and meet up with the stranded airmen, and they would use the long line to pull themselves through the surf and onto the wherry. As he was about to jump in, he saw something shift in his peripheral vision. So he grabbed the torch that was held in the bows of the boat and shone it directly down into the seabed. It was powerful enough to light up the seabed below. Passing through that beam of light were no less than 5-6 metre long sharks. Cook jumped in all the same and astonishingly swam through that surf. It was the first of 5 separate swims that he would do from the wherry to the beach over the course of several nights. Quite rightly, he was awarded the Navy Cross, the second highest military decoration in the United States Navy. Again, were it not for this man's gallantry, I wouldn't be standing here before you tonight. When I think of the capacity that we have for unbelievable endurance, I think of aircraftman Phil King. Nobody suffered as much as Phil and lived to tell the tale. As you can see in this photo, through malnourishment, Phil lost his front teeth, but he also lost a considerable amount of weight. He went away to Timor weighing approximately 92 kilograms. Over the space of 10 weeks, I should say, he came back here in Perth and was weighed at 38 kilograms. Somehow he lived to tell the tale. He would have to convalesce on this bed in Perth for a period of 6 months. Astonishingly, he would return to active service a week after being released from this hospital and would be sent up to Lae towards the end of the war. Amazing. When I think of the human capacity to corrupt ability and intelligence towards evil ends, I think of Masao Yamabe. Yamabe was undoubtedly an extraordinary soldier. He took command of the first experimental Japanese naval paratroopers, around which all paratroop units would be built in the Japanese army and navy. And he built it very much in his image. He organised or he designed parachutes, weaponry, strategy, the whole works. He did this by translating a Russian text into Japanese, the Russians having been the first to develop light airborne infantry. He was also fanatical. He called himself a chungat, which is a derogatory Korean term which is generally applied to men past the prime marrying age. Now, at the age of 24, you can see that Yamabe was far from past the prime marrying age. He wore it as a badge of honour because he believed the dictates of being a soldier were akin to the dictates of leading the life of a monk. That meant a life of asceticism, single-minded devotion, most importantly a life without a wife and children. Only could a man call himself a soldier if he went into battle without worrying about who he was leaving behind at home. That's what Yamabe said. In a nation full of extremists, this man was an absolute fanatic, and he was at the heart of every execution that would be carried out in Dutch West Timor. He took command of, he became commander of the Guard, which effectively meant rounding up all displaced servicemen in Dutch Timor. There are horrors in this story, but there are also great heroics, and there are also examples, finally, of enduring love and great devotion. These are my grandparents. This photo was taken in June 1942, 2 months after they got married on Flinders Street in Melbourne. When I look at this photo, which incidentally I only saw for the first time a couple of years ago, I never saw this photo displayed for reasons I don't understand. My grandmother never displayed this photo, which is a fabulous photo, I think, and at the very least reveals how my grandparents lived in a very stylish age. When I look at this photo now, having researched this book and written this book, I see something that I didn't notice on the first time. I see a certain uncertainty in my grandfather's gaze, a certain suspicion, a wavering of the foot, which my mother always tells me is just because my grandfather was pigeon-toed. But it contrasts very sharply with the look of confidence of my grandmother, striding out purposefully along Flinders Street, looking up at the Melbourne skyline. What I've learned about this story, shortly after this photo was taken, within about 24 hours, my grandfather would experience his first post-Timor malarial attack. These were things that would plague him for the rest of his life. The story about my grandfather's experience on Timor is also a story of great tragedy. Undoubtedly, it awoke in him certain characteristics that were not there before he went away. My grandmother would always say, and she never said a bad word about Brian Rose, but she did say that the man for whom she fell in love was not the man that returned from Timor. Like every one of those stranded 29 airmen, this was an experience which plagued them for the rest of their lives. All of them would get malarial attacks, all of them would have nightmarish flashbacks. One of the great revelations for me about writing this book was having the great privilege of reading all of the letters that my grandparents wrote to each other during the war. Some of those letters were written from Mearsdale and Sale. They made a pact to write each other a letter for every day that they were apart during the war. My family has 2,000 letters in its possession. On August 27, 1971, my grandmother, who was an avid diarist, wrote a single entry in her journal on that day. Brian died at 7 a.m. Dear God, why? When I think of my grandmother at that moment, I can't help being inspired about what she did next. She took all of that pain and that confusion and that uncertainty, say nothing of the forced relocation from Melbourne back to Adelaide where they were from, and chose to become the figurehead of my family. A rallying point, as I always say, in times of triumph or tragedy, and the meeting point in times of triumph. I think every family is exposed to tragedies of sorts and hardships, but not every family can say that they had a figurehead like my grandmother. For that reason, I dedicated this book to her memory. So ladies and gentlemen, that concludes my presentation. Thank you so much for being such an attentive audience. Thank you. If anyone has any questions as well, feel free to fire away. Yeah.
I was just wondering, you mentioned the four men you met who were quite integral to this whole story.
Yep.
How easy or difficult was it to get them to open up to talk so that you got what information you got?
It was varying degrees for each of them. One man, particularly Frank, was not interested in talking about it for any more than an hour. Frank Rosconi, who interestingly his father was the man who built the dog in the tucker box, and the other guy, and who met Joe Lyons, which gives you an impression of the timeline we're talking. But Frank didn't want to talk about it for more than an hour. It was a very traumatic experience for him. Eddie Park, when you read the book, you realise he was a bit of a larrikin. I couldn't get him to stop talking about it. And the other two, Clyde and Len, were very generous with their time. On several occasions, Len broke down talking about it, saying this is an experience that I haven't spoken about in 70 years, but I've thought about every day of my life. And he actually had a painting that was a picture that was painted by his daughter's father-in-law of the rescue of the wherry rowing out to the Sea Raven that hangs in his dining room. So he often just says he sits there and looks at that and thinks, Christ, I was lucky. But it was an experience which stayed with them all, and it was difficult. I like to think for Len it was cathartic. Yeah, I mean, if nothing else, I developed an unbelievable appreciation for that generation, you know, the generation that went through the Depression and the war, and then sort of rebuilt the nation, really. I think they had a great sort of set of values, and I find them inspirational. Sorry, yeah.
What sort of time did it take you from the time you decided to write the story until you finished it? I mean, you did a lot of research.
I set almost everything else aside to focus on the book. So I went to Timor in June 2011, and that's really when the research kicked off, and then finished the research, although the research and the writing sort of overlapped a little bit. Essentially finished the bulk of the research in early March 2012, and then just sat down and went and started writing. Yeah, I was very lucky though, because there is a lot of research in this book, but about 40% of it was my grandfather's. It was in the family, official reports, diaries, and letters and stuff. So that helped considerably. Right.
Tom, I think that the story that you put together, not just the story of your grandfather, but the story of those men, is just remarkable, and I think your grandparents would be very, very proud of what you've done. But what was the defining moment where you thought, okay, I'm going to spend so much time researching this and put it together as a book?
Well, I set off to write a book about it. That's what I mean.
What made you decide to do that? What took your interest after so many years to tell that story?
I think it just was timing was right, the convergence of a whole lot of things. I'd written that first book, Unholy Pilgrim, so I pitched it to a publisher. I had a publisher's ear, which is so important. And I said, in a way I was reluctant to do it because, being so close to this story and having a cursory knowledge of the facts of the story, I wasn't really aware of how amazing it was until I sort of stepped back and pitched it to the publisher. And she said, yeah, that's a great yarn. But I was just fortunate. I had time up my sleeve to be able to do it, I guess. I say the untold story. There has been, that's a publisher's liberty there. There has been a self-published book that was written by one of the survivors. There was a television series in the 50s called The Silent Service, which was a dramatisation of all American submarine rescues during the Second World War, exciting submarine stories, and they dramatised the American side of this. But this is the sort of complete, bringing in the Japanese, the Timorese and the Australian side of the story. But it didn't take long for me to realise that I was very fortunate to be able to write the story and have all the research at my disposal. I couldn't believe that a historian hadn't come pick this one up and written it, because I think it's great. I think it would adapt well to the silver screen as well. Fingers crossed.
Can I ask another question?
Yeah.
In families, the stories that you hear. I had an uncle who was in New Guinea, and he used to always be telling us a story, but as younger people we didn't really want to hear about it. It wasn't we weren't particularly interested. With your family, and I know your mum and dad are here, had this story been told by your grandfather through the family, or was he reluctant to talk about it?
Well, my understanding is that he never talked about it. He was extremely reluctant to talk about it, and consistent with the age. This was a man who's probably had post-traumatic stress, and consistent with the age, that was either ignored or went undiagnosed, and so he just bottled it up. And all of those, the 4 survivors who I've met said that they hadn't talked about it with their families. And that's something that I've heard a lot of, that the baby boomers all say their parents never talked about their war experiences.
It does seem that there is, with the proliferation of publications, that there seems to be a change in people now wanting to perhaps tell their stories.
Yes.
Albeit very late.
Yeah.
In the whole sequence.
Absolutely. But I think it's also to do with this kind of, Anzac Day is such a day of national commemoration now. Even in my lifetime, I remember it not being as big when I was, younger than it is now. It's just huge. And coming towards the 100th anniversary of Gallipoli, I'm coming in on the wave of that enthusiasm. So, yeah. Anyone else?
Any other questions?
How much support did you get from the War Memorial?
Good support, excellent support, but most of the information that I was looking at was held in the National Australian Archives, which I think is an untapped resource and is just fantastic. I went into there's a Melbourne office. There's an office in all of the major cities, but it's Canberra, which obviously holds the most material, and where the major repositories are kept. And I went into the reading room at least 15 times, and there was never more than one person in there. I couldn't believe it. And it's just it holds all of the personnel records, official reports, and there was a lot of information about this. The reason it hasn't been told is partly due to the fact that the story was classified during the life of the war. This was the first rescue of displaced servicemen in the islands, trapped in the islands in Australia's near north by an American submarine. And although it had been theorised that such a rescue was possible, it has never been carried out. So for that reason it was classified. By the time that classification was lifted, which was towards the end of the war, the Japanese were on the back foot, the Allies were clawing back territory, and there was no need for a kind of morale-boosting story of this nature. The war had sort of moved on, which was, I suppose, the good from my perspective, but a tragedy in many respects that these men didn't receive in their lifetime the plaudits that I deserve. Yeah.
I've got two questions. First one is your research into the Japanese soldiers. How difficult was that? And just to get those names that were involved in the first place.
Again, that was the National Australian Archives. I was, hoping it was a sort of a Hail Mary thing because I expected not to be able to get any Japanese information. But I started looking at the war crimes tribunals, which are all of that information is digitised now, so you can look at it online, which is very helpful because they're all of the court transcripts, sworn statements, affidavits, the whole bit, interrogation notes. And there was a recurring name in all of these war crimes tribunals, and that was Masao Yamabe, that man that I put out. And I did a basic Google search. It started there and discovered that he'd written an autobiography about his experiences during the war. Obviously, he leaves out all of the war crime stuff. But I was very fortunate that my girlfriend, who was studying up in Singapore at the time, had a very close Japanese friend, has a very close Japanese friend, who was more than happy to translate vast tracts of that book. And so I could piece together a personality of the man, the stuff about how he called himself Chungak, and how he perceived himself, and then the court transcripts were so illuminating about his character and other characters in the Japanese naval paratroopers. They were regarded as the best of the best. They were called the sons of heaven in the sky. So there was a lot of information around these paratroopers. So that was the Japanese side of the story.
And the second question, how many from that original paratrooper drop actually survived to be rescued on the trip through?
All the Australian Army got through, yeah. But the paratroopers were nearly decimated, incidentally, by the Australian forces. 800 paratroopers dropped over 2 days, and they were basically cut in half.
Probably cut in half because they dropped to 400 feet.
Yeah. One thing that's amazing is that I was forwarded. There's a Sparrow Force Association based up in Queensland, even though Sparrow Force spiritual home is in Tasmania. This is the detachment of units that was built up around the 8th Division, the detachment of 8th Division units sent to garrison the airfield. There's a bloke who I've been in close contact with researching this book. He's found archival footage of the paratroop drop from the Japanese perspective. It's just extraordinary. Yeah. Amazing. Yeah.
Well, thank you, and on behalf of everyone, I think that's a fascinating story, and I think it's the book's already doing well, and we get information from Nielsen Bookstand, so we know how the book's going at the moment. And,
you probably know better than that.
Yeah, I think we do. And we're actually just talking because we think it fit in very well to our Hill of Content catalogue, which is due in the spring. I think the story's a ripper, and I think these stories that are coming out now, they're creating so much interest. It's just there's a real collection of people that are just looking at these stories and reading them now. It's fascinating. So well done. Thank you very much on behalf of Collins for coming tonight. And there's a few books left. We've sold a lot more than we got in a certain amount of event stock. We sold a hell of a lot more than we thought we would before the event. So I think there's about 14 or 15 left, but first in, best dressed. And if we haven't got them tonight, you can order them in for Father's Day. So we'll have them here by then. But thank you very much.